Brazil deploys 600 troops and 28 armored vehicles to Venezuela border, the silent military buildup stopping South America's next war before it starts. November 3, 2023. Roraima State, Brazil. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro held a referendum claiming 2/3 of neighboring Guyana's territory, the Essequibo region, 160,000 square kilometers, oil-rich waters, vast untapped resources. Venezuela voted to annex it. Guyana called it an existential threat. And Brazil, sharing borders with both nations, made a calculation. Military force positioned before the shooting starts prevents the war nobody can afford. Within 72 hours, Brazilian armored columns were moving north through the Amazon. This wasn't intervention. This was deterrence. Let me show you how Brazil built a military wall between two nations on the brink, why nobody noticed until it was already in place, and what happens when regional powers enforce peace through overwhelming presence. The Essequibo dispute dates back to 1899. Britain controlled Guyana then. An international tribunal awarded the territory to British Guiana. Venezuela rejected the decision. For 124 years, the dispute simmered. Diplomatic protests, occasional tensions, nothing serious. Then, Exxon discovered oil offshore Essequibo in 2015. Massive deposits. Current production, 645,000 barrels daily. Estimated reserves, 11 billion barrels. Suddenly, the dispute wasn't academic anymore. It was about billions in annual revenue. Venezuela's economy was collapsing under sanctions and mismanagement. Maduro needed money. Essequibo had money. The math was dangerous. The December 3rd referendum was theatrical politics. Maduro asked Venezuelans if Essequibo belonged to Venezuela. The regime claimed 95% voted yes. International observers called it fraudulent. But the vote gave Maduro domestic cover for aggressive posturing. He ordered maps redrawn showing Essequibo as Venezuelan territory. He created state oil subsidiaries for the region. He increased military activity near the border. Satellite imagery captured Venezuelan troops building roads, bridges, and airstrips in border areas. The construction was rapid, purposeful, unmistakably military preparation. Guyana's population is 800,000 people. Their defense force numbers 3,400 troops. Venezuela has 123,000 active military personnel. The imbalance was terrifying. What's your prediction for this crisis? Type A if you think Venezuela will attempt military action. Type B if diplomatic pressure will contain the situation. Brazil shares a 2,199-kilometer border with Venezuela and 1,606 kilometers with Guyana. Any Venezuelan military move toward Essequibo would require crossing Brazilian territory or pushing through dense Amazonian jungle where logistics are nightmarish. Brazilian President Lula made Brazil's position clear on December 8th. Venezuela would not use Brazilian soil for military operations under any circumstances. That wasn't a request. That was a line drawn with the full weight of South America's largest military behind it. To enforce that line, Brazil activated Operation Roraima. The name was bureaucratic. The execution was decisive. The Brazilian Army's Northern Command began moving assets in late November 2023. Initial deployments were discreet. Troop rotations, equipment transfers, nothing that screamed military buildup. But by January 2024, the scale became undeniable. 14 Guaycurús light armored vehicles departed Campo Grande, 2,400 kilometers south, headed to Boa Vista, the capital of Roraima State. These are 4x4 multi-role vehicles. Top speed, 110 kilometers per hour. Armament, 12.7mm machine guns or 40mm grenade launchers, perfect for border patrol and rapid response. 50 soldiers accompanied the convoy. The journey took 8 days across roads that barely qualified as roads, but they arrived, and they kept arriving. By February 2024, 28 armored vehicles reached Roraima. 6 EE-09 Cascavel reconnaissance vehicles. These are 606 platforms mounting 90 mm cannons. Range, 2.5 kilometers. Designed to engage light armor and fortified positions. 8 Guarani armored personnel carriers. 6x6 configuration. Capacity, 11 troops. Amphibious capable for river crossings. 14 additional Guaycurus for mobility and flexibility. The armor wasn't symbolic, it was functional. Brazil was building a mechanized cavalry regiment from scratch in the Amazon. The 18th Mechanized Cavalry Regiment. Planned completion, 2025. Final strength, 600 soldiers organized into 3 squadrons. This wasn't temporary deployment, this was permanent infrastructure. The logistics were staggering. Moving armored vehicles through the Amazon requires rivers. The equipment traveled by barge from Porto Velho to Manaus, 1,200 kilometers, 8 days on the water. From Manaus, convoys drove 780 kilometers north to Boa Vista on BR-174, the only paved highway connecting Manaus to Venezuela's border. The road cuts through rainforest where bridges are scarce and ambush sites are everywhere. Military police battalions escorted every convoy. They weren't taking chances with equipment worth millions, traveling through territory where illegal miners and smugglers operate freely. Every vehicle that left southern Brazil arrived in Roraima. 0 losses. That's professional logistics executed under pressure. If this deep dive into how military deterrence actually works on the ground is valuable, make sure you're subscribed to catch future analysis like this. Brazil didn't just send armor, they sent lethality. In December 2023, the Army deployed hundreds of MSS 1.2 anti-tank missiles to Roraima. These are Brazilian-designed weapons. Range, 4,000 meters. Guidance, wire or fiber optic. Warhead, tandem-shaped charge capable of defeating reactive armor. Venezuela operates Russian T-72 tanks and Chinese VN-1 armored personnel carriers. The MSS 1.2 can kill both. The message was clear. If Venezuelan armor crossed into Brazilian territory, it would burn. Brazil published the deployment. They wanted Venezuela to know. Deterrence requires credibility. Credibility requires capability everyone can see. The 1st Jungle Infantry Brigade, already stationed in Roraima with 2,000 personnel, intensified border patrols. These troops specialize in jungle warfare. They operate in terrain where conventional militaries fail. The Amazon is not desert or plains. It's 60-meter canopy, rivers disguised as mud, and visibility measured in meters. The jungle infantry trains for ambush tactics, riverine operations, and survival in conditions that kill unprepared soldiers within days. They patrolling the 435-kilometer stretch between Pacaraima and Boa Vista. Pacaraima sits directly on the Venezuelan border. It's the choke point. Any ground invasion crosses there. Brazil fortified it with permanent observation posts, reinforced checkpoints, and quick reaction forces staged minutes away. The buildup addressed 2 threats simultaneously. First, Venezuelan military action through Brazilian territory. Second, Venezuelan military buildup disguised as infrastructure development. Brazilian intelligence detected increased activity at Venezuelan bases near the border. New roads, expanded airfields, troop concentrations. The Joint Chiefs of Staff analyzed the data and concluded Venezuela lacked logistical capacity for sustained operations deep into Guyanese territory. The jungle is too dense, supply lines too vulnerable. But Venezuela could seize border towns. They could create facts on the ground. They could force international negotiations from a position of territorial control. That scenario required prevention. Brazil prevented it by making the cost unacceptable. The diplomatic component ran parallel to military deployment. Brazil hosted talks between Venezuela and Guyana in Brasilia on January 25, 2024. Foreign ministers met. Tensions were high, but they talked. On December 14, 2023, St. Vincent and the Grenadines hosted a summit. Ralph Gonçalves, the Prime Minister, mediated. Lula sent representatives. The Caribbean community participated. United Nations observers attended. The result was the Argyle Agreement. Both nations pledged not to use force. They committed to resolving disputes through international law. Venezuela refused to recognize the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction, but agreed to diplomatic solutions. It was paper. But paper backed by Brazilian armor carries weight. Paper alone doesn't. What would you do as Brazil's military commander when two neighbors prepare for conflict on your doorstep? Allow it and risk spillover? Intervene directly? Or deploy forces as a deterrent wall? Comment your strategy. American involvement complicated the picture. The United States conducted military overflights monitoring Venezuelan troop movements in December 2023. They shared intelligence with Guyana. U.S. Southern Command increased engagement with Guyanese defense forces. High-level American officials visited Georgetown. The message was support without direct intervention. America wouldn't fight Venezuela over Essequibo, but America would make any Venezuelan attack costly through sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and military support to Guyana. Brazil viewed American involvement with suspicion. Lula's government prefers regional solutions to regional problems. American military presence in South America triggers historical anxieties about imperialism. Brazil positioned itself as the guarantor of South American peace precisely to limit American influence. The military buildup served domestic political goals as much as security objectives. The cost analysis was revealing. Brazil spent approximately $180 million deploying and equipping the 18th Mechanized Cavalry Regiment. That includes vehicles, weapons, infrastructure, and personnel over 2 years. Compare that to war. A military conflict between Venezuela and Guyana would destabilize the region. Refugees would flood Brazil's northern border. Illegal armed groups would exploit chaos. Drug trafficking would surge. Oil production would collapse, spiking global energy prices. The economic damage to Brazil alone would exceed $10 billion. Spending $180 million to prevent $10 billion in losses is brutal mathematics. It's cheaper to build a military wall than rebuild after war destroys everything. Venezuela noticed. By February 2024, satellite imagery showed Venezuelan troops withdrawing from forward positions near the Guyanese border. Construction at military bases slowed. Aggressive rhetoric cooled. Maduro agreed to a second summit in March 2024. The crisis de-escalated not because Venezuela abandoned claims to Essequibo, but because military action became impractical. Brazil blocked the land route. The jungle blocked everything else. Guyana, backed by international law and Western support, wasn't collapsing into negotiations. The cost-benefit calculation shifted. Maduro achieved domestic political victory through the referendum. Actually, seizing territory would cost more than Venezuela could afford. Brazil made sure of that. The broader lesson is deterrence works when backed by capability and will. Brazil demonstrated both. They moved armor. They deployed missiles. They fortified borders. They told Venezuela no and meant it. Deterrence fails when adversaries doubt commitment or capability. Venezuela didn't doubt. The 18th Mechanized Cavalry Regiment exists. The MSS 1.2 missiles are real. The Jungle Infantry Brigade patrols daily. Doubt isn't possible when you can see the weapons on satellite imagery and hear the engines across the border. That's the difference between empty threats and credible deterrence. Brazil built credibility one armored vehicle at a time. The hours of detailed research that go into tactical breakdowns like this don't happen without support. Hit that subscribe button to help us keep producing this level of analysis. The Essequibo crisis also exposed vulnerabilities in South American security architecture. Regional organizations like UNASUR and Mercosur lack enforcement mechanisms. They issue statements, they host dialogues, but they cannot deploy military force. When push comes to shove, peace depends on individual nations willing to act. Brazil acted because Brazilian interests demanded it. Stability on Brazil's borders protects Brazilian economic development. Lula invested billions in infrastructure connecting northern Brazil to global markets. BR-174 highway improvements, port expansions in Manaus, agricultural development in Roraima. War destroys infrastructure. Refugees disrupt development. Brazil couldn't allow instability. So Brazil deployed overwhelming force to guarantee stability. That's realpolitik disguised as peacekeeping. The illegal mining connection added complexity. Roraima suffers from massive illegal gold mining operations. Garimpeiros, as Brazilian miners are called, devastate indigenous territories. They use mercury. They destroy rivers. They bring violence and disease. An estimated 20,000 illegal miners operate in Yanomami indigenous lands alone. Many cross from Venezuela. Some are Venezuelan military members supplementing starvation wages with gold profits. A war would supercharge illegal mining. Enforcement would collapse. Criminal networks would exploit chaos. Brazil's military presence in Roraima simultaneously deters Venezuelan aggression and supports anti-mining operations. The 18th Mechanized Cavalry Regiment's creation was planned since 2009 specifically to combat transborder crime, including narco-trafficking and illegal mining. The Venezuela crisis accelerated deployment timelines, but the underlying mission addresses long-term criminal threats that won't disappear when diplomatic tensions ease. Indigenous communities watched the military buildup with mixed feelings. The Yanomami people suffered genocidal conditions under former President Bolsonaro. Illegal miners invaded their lands. The military ignored it or actively facilitated it. Lula promised protection. Deploying troops to Roraima was part of fulfilling that promise. But indigenous leaders remained skeptical. Military presence can protect or oppress depending on political winds. They demand permanent commitment to defending indigenous territories, not temporary deployments motivated by international crises. Brazil's challenge is proving the 18th Regiment will remain after headlines fade. Only sustained presence and operational tempo against illegal miners will build trust. Words are cheap. Destroying mining equipment and arresting criminals is expensive. That expense demonstrates seriousness. The International Court of Justice ruled on the Essequibo dispute in April 2023, asserting jurisdiction. A full trial is scheduled for 2024 and beyond. Legal resolution takes years. Military deterrence operates on days and hours. Brazil bought time for international law to work. If Venezuela attacks before the ICJ rules, international condemnation is guaranteed. But condemnation without military consequences is meaningless. Brazil provides the consequences. Attack Guyana, cross Brazilian territory, face Brazilian armor. That calculation keeps Venezuelan tanks in their bases. It keeps Venezuelan troops building roads that go nowhere militarily useful. It preserves a status quo where Guyana controls Essequibo, Venezuela protests diplomatically, and nobody dies. That's success in conflict prevention. American policymakers watched Brazil's response carefully. The U.S. spent decades positioning itself as hemisphere's security guarantor. Brazil demonstrated that regional powers can enforce regional peace independently. This complicates American strategy. If South American nations resolve crises without U.S. involvement, American influence diminishes. But if U.S. forces had deployed to Roraima, It would spark nationalist backlash across South America. Brazil's action was politically palatable precisely because it wasn't American. Regional powers acting regionally generates legitimacy. American power projection cannot achieve. The Pentagon recognized this. They supported Brazil behind scenes with intelligence sharing and quiet diplomatic backing. But the boots on ground, the armor at the border, the deterrent force was Brazilian. That matters for future crises. South America may not need American military intervention if Brazil continues playing regional enforcer role. Was Brazil's military buildup on the Venezuela border a necessary deterrent that prevented war, or an overreaction to a crisis that was never really going to explode? Drop your assessment in the comments. The 18th Mechanized Cavalry Regiment will reach full operational capability in 2025. 600 soldiers, 3 squadrons, permanent bases, ongoing operations. Brazil transformed temporary crisis response into enduring military presence. That's strategic thinking. The next crisis won't require months of deployment. The forces will already be there. Future Venezuelan governments will know Brazilian armor sits 180 kilometers from their border. Future Guyanese governments will know Brazil backs their territorial integrity with more than words. Future crises will factor in Brazilian military power before escalating. That's deterrence with staying power. That's how you shape behavior over decades, not months. The Amazon presents unique military challenges. Dense jungle limits visibility. Rivers dictate movement. Supply lines stretch over thousands of kilometers. Disease and climate stress troops. Conventional military doctrine breaks down. Brazil adapted. They deployed light armor suitable for jungle roads. They positioned forces at strategic chokes. They leveraged existing infrastructure. They accepted that controlling the Amazon means controlling rivers and roads, not occupying endless forest. The 18th Regiment isn't trying to patrol every square kilometer. They're securing critical nodes. Pacaraima, Boa Vista, BR-174 Highway, the Branco River. Control those, and you control military access to the region. Let Venezuela have the jungle. Brazil owns the infrastructure that matters. Freedom and sovereignty require the will to defend borders when diplomacy fails. Brazil demonstrated that will. They deployed force when talk seemed insufficient. They backed threats with capability. They drew lines and meant them. That's how nations preserve peace. Not through wishful thinking. Not through diplomatic notes alone. Through credible military power positioned where adversaries can see it, calculate against it, and choose not to fight. Venezuela chose not to fight. The Essequibo remains Guyanese. The crisis de-escalated, and South America avoided war. That's victory measured in deaths prevented and borders secured. So here's what demands answers. Should other South American nations follow Brazil's model and build permanent military presence in border regions? Is Brazilian military deterrence sustainable long-term, or will budget pressures force drawdowns? Could this military buildup accidentally trigger the very conflict it's designed to prevent? Think about these questions and share your perspective below. And if this examination of real-world military deterrence, strategic deployment, and how power actually prevents wars instead of fighting them opened your eyes to how modern security really works, then subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that peace has a price, and sometimes that price is armor, troops, and the will to use them. Hit like if detailed analysis of underreported military operations matters to you. The 18th Mechanized Cavalry Regiment patrols Roraima's borders today. Venezuelan troops remain on their side. Guyanese territory remains Guyanese. The crisis continues simmering beneath diplomatic surfaces. But the shooting never started. That's because Brazil made sure both sides understood the cost. Your engagement tells us you value this level of tactical and strategic insight. Subscribe, comment, and let's keep examining the hard truths about how military power shapes peace in the 21st century.